What is up guys, Photo Fever here, and today we are looking at this dinosaur of a lens. This is the Canon 135mm f2.L USM lens. And I'm going to start right now. This lens here is by far one of the oldest, still current Canon L series lenses on the market. In fact, you can still buy it brand new today in 2022. And this lens dates all the way back to its original release in 1996. In fact, it's almost got the same birth year as me, so it really does show you how old this lens is. In fact, it was originally designed for film SLR cameras, but a lot has changed since then. DSLRs and also mirrorless cameras are now out with incredibly high resolution, such as the 45 megapixel Canon EOS R5. So how well does this lens's optics perform versus brand new cameras? Well, let's find out in this lens review. Now, because this lens is designed in a completely different era to lenses today, the actual design of this lens has changed drastically. The overall design, I'm not swayed upon. I must say I prefer newer lenses, especially the RF lenses with the more minimal design. Now, when you pick this lens up, you'll notice how lightweight it is, and that's because it's actually a simple optical formula, just with 10 elements in 8 groups. You think more modern lenses have far more complicated optics, which actually make them heavier. Now, when you pick this lens up, you'll notice that it doesn't have weather sealing, which is one of the biggest gripes I've got with this lens. A lens of over £1,000, you'd expect it to have weather sealing, but to be honest, it doesn't, and it's something that I really wish it did have. If it did, to be honest, this would be a really all one-of-a-kind lens. Now, it does have everything else you'd expect. It has a focus window that you can see here. It's also got a focus ring, which is actually quite large and almost the full size of the lens. And then you've also got 2 switches on the side. You've got the autofocus to manual focus switch, but you've also got a focus limiter switch as well, which goes from 0.9 meters to infinity, and you can also narrow it down to 1.6 meters to infinity. The buttons are the smaller plastic design back from the early 90s, and I've got to admit the newer buttons are far better because they're larger, and because of that you can have gloves and you can use it in an outdoor environment. This lens isn't necessarily designed for that because it doesn't come with weather sealing, but I wish it did. So I'm not going to be giving it the full marks because other lenses do have better build quality, so I'm only going to be giving it an 8 out of 10. Now, because this lens was designed originally for film cameras, you wouldn't expect the best image quality, and that's where this lens surprises you. This lens has exquisite image quality, far better than even some of the brand new lenses that Canon are releasing. So let's go and have a look at a few sample images that we've got that I took at a wedding. Now, this lens here is great for portraits and specifically headshots. Now, with the very tight focal length of 135mm, it's not an everyday use lens. It's a very specific use lens. And for when you're using it for weddings and fast-paced events, like for instance, either you're doing portrait work, this lens is exquisite and definitely a spot in your camera bag. The overall sharpness of this lens is paramount, one of the sharpest kind of telephoto lenses that are currently on the market. And then when you couple that with the f2 aperture, you can really separate your foreground and background. Now again, like I was saying, it is not necessarily for everyone. A tight focal length can be difficult to use, but to get the best out of this lens, I'd highly recommend using it either for portraits or for more high magnification work, like for instance events. So let's go and have a look at more scientifically by looking at the sharpness of the graph. Now, like I was saying previously, this lens was designed originally for film cameras, so I wasn't expecting the best image sharpness, but when we go ahead and zoom in straight out the gate at f2, you can see how sharp this lens is. Now, this lens is by far one of the sharpest telephoto lenses out there, far sharper than any zoom lens, and I would actually say it's sharper than the 100mm, which was at the moment the sharpest lens I've tested. Then let me go ahead and step down to 2.8. You can see that sharpness is still there, and it gets even sharper when you step down to either f4, then you step down to f5.6, all the way to f8. Now, anything beyond that, I did notice kind of diffraction starting to take shape and the corners softening slightly, but I would still say it outperforms a lot of zoom lenses with the same telephoto focal length. So overall, I would say this lens is by far one of the sharpest telephoto lenses I've ever tested, and I really like this lens for image quality. So let's go ahead and look at distortion and vignetting. So another great point is the distortion and vignetting aspect of this lens. very little distortion and pretty much no vignetting to be seen. There is a slight amount in the corners, wide open at f2, but I must say it really handles it very well, and the projection of the actual image is very flat, with very little pincushion or very little barrel distortion. So again, this lens really does perform very well, even on high resolution mirrorless cameras that are out in 2022. To think this was originally designed for film cameras, so you can really see how well the optical formula was designed originally in this lens. So overall, to be honest, I can't give this praise enough. This lens is absolutely spectacular when it comes to image quality. The only real downside to this lens when it comes to its image quality is the flaring aspect. This has absolute horrendous flaring, complete loss of contrast in the center of the frame or anywhere near when you point it in bright lights. Now you do have a decent sized lens hood with this lens, so I'd highly recommend using it for that, but it's also got a fairly high telephoto look. So overall, I can't recommend this lens enough when it comes to image quality. The only real gripe I've got is that really poor flaring, but to be honest, most lenses from the 90s and early 2000s have the same problem. Only recent lenses have been able to actually achieve a high flaring reduction. So it's not something I'm majorly going to knock this lens down on because it's such a specific thing that not everyone's going to end up bumping into that problem. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it the full marks, the 10 out of 10. So now let's move on to size and weight. And as I mentioned previously, this lens is actually quite light, and that's just due to the fairly simple optical formula. Again, only having 10 elements in 8 groups. Compared to more modern lenses, specifically art series lenses made by Sigma, they are far heavier and far larger. This lens here comes in at just 700 grams, which is very, very light when you compare it to the other lenses on the market. For instance, the Sigma 135mm f1.8 comes in a whopping 1,130 grams. Then if we compare it to the Zeiss lens, which has actually got the same aperture of f2, that comes in at 1,060 grams, around about 400 grams heavier than this lens here, with in fact the same aperture. And then lastly, we've got the Canon 70-200mm. I thought I'd throw that in there to kind of give you a reference point of other lenses that can achieve that, although this is a zoom lens. And that comes in a whopping 1,440 grams, which is kind of obvious because it is a zoom lens. So if you're after a small, lightweight lens, this lens here is going to be perfect. And with a focal length of just 72mm, it's going to be ideal if you're after a small, lightweight lens that offers a great telephoto reach. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it a 9 out of 10 for size and weight. Moving on to autofocus and image stabilization now. Now, to be honest, if this lens had image stabilization, which it doesn't, to be honest, it would probably be crap. 90s lenses with image stabilization always were rubbish. And again, to be honest, it was first generation anyway, so I'm glad it doesn't because it'd be rubbish anyway. The actual autofocus of this lens is a different story though. Very fast and to be honest, very precise. I was actually using at the same time, using the 85mm Sigma, and I found that the autofocus was a lot slower and a lot more cumbersome. Always seemed to be missing or forward or back focusing, where I found this lens here was a dream to use, even in low light situations. It found that subject and locked on. It was really good for a fast-paced environment like a wedding, and it's something that I'd highly recommend buying this lens for. It was really good and fun to use, and the actual image stabilization was not necessarily a problem because I was shooting at higher shutter speeds because of the aperture of f2. So the overall autofocus of this lens really set it apart from other lenses like for instance the 70-200mm that I also used because it's faster autofocus. Again, simpler optics, lighter glass, a quicker autofocus motor. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it a 7 out of 10. Now lastly, but most importantly, is price. Now because you can buy this lens brand new, I'm going to be carrying its brand new price versus other lenses. But do bear in mind, because of the age of this lens, you can probably get it for around £500 secondhand. So if you're looking at this lens, you can pretty much knock about 50% off just because it's secondhand. But we are going to be comparing it to its brand new price because it is still currently available. So kick it off, the Canon 135mm f2 comes in at a whopping £1,059. Next down from that is the Sigma 135mm f1.8. That comes in at a whopping £1,099. Very similar in price, although the Sigma does have a slightly brighter aperture of f1.8. Next, let's talk about the Zeiss 135mm f2. Probably the more expensive lens, but it's also a lens I haven't actually tested, so it's not something I can necessarily talk about. But that comes in at £1,929. by far the most expensive on our list today. And then lastly is the Canon 70 to 200mm 2.8. Again, it offers an aperture of 2.8, but it has the versatility of its zoom range between 70 to 200mm, where this is just 135mm. But to just put this lens into context, this price comes in at £2,199. So if you're looking at the overall price, this lens is probably the best value for money, even when you compare it to the Sigma lens, especially if you get it secondhand for around about £500. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it a good score of 8 out of 10. So now let's quickly move on to pros and cons to really work out, is this lens worth a spot in your camera bag? Let's have a look at the pros first. This lens is super duper sharp and by far one of the sharpest telephoto lenses you're ever going to have in your camera bag. This lens has also got great bokeh. 135mm focal length coupled with the aperture, this lens is great for separating your foreground and background subjects. To be honest, this lens has got overall great image quality, far better than any other telephoto lens that you're going to have in your camera bag. And because of the simple optical formula, it's nice and small as well, which is going to be great if you've got a small, lightweight camera setup. It's also, because of the age, really cheap as well, especially if you look at the second-hand market. It's still expensive brand new, but you can knock about 500 quid off that asking price if you go ahead and look at second-hand. So now let's look at the cons and why you shouldn't have this lens in your camera bag. It's an older design, and because of that, it's not necessarily great if you're wanting to have weather sealing or image stabilization. This lens has got incredibly bad flaring, one of the worst lenses I've ever tested when it comes to the flaring aspect. Do not point this lens at a bright light. This lens also has the lacking of weather sealing, which is probably just my biggest gripe with this lens. If it had weather sealing, I'd probably be scoring a lot higher. And also, the lack of image stabilization can be a problem in low light situations. If you have a mirrorless camera, not necessarily a problem because you've got IBIS, but other lenses outperform this lens when it comes to image stabilization because they're a lot newer. So overall, it's a mixed bag. Because of the age of this lens, you don't have all of the new features that you'd want, like for instance, weather sealing or image stabilization, but it really does help with the amazing optics that this lens has. So now let's go and have a look at final results. To be honest, this lens really did blow me away, and it was something I wasn't expecting. I knew this lens was sharp, but I didn't think it was this sharp. This lens is been designed back in the 90s, so I really was surprised. I thought the overall image quality of this lens is actually far superior than some newer lenses on the market, even better than some of the Sigma lenses that are even probably the same price. Coming in with a score of 42 out of 50, this is a highly recommended lens to have in your camera bag. Grant you, it doesn't have everything. For instance, it doesn't have that really important weather sealing and it doesn't have image stabilization. It's missing some of those new features that you'd expect from lenses of today's standard. But to think this lens is so old and it still has great image quality. So if you're after a great, well-built lens with all the new features, there might be better lenses out there. But if you're just wanting the best image quality from your lens, look no further than the Canon 135mm f2.L. Now, do you agree with my review today? Do you own this lens? Do you want to own this lens? Have you owned this lens? Make sure to write it down in the comments below to help your fellow photographers out. I want to create a great community here where we support each other. And I think the best way to do that is to write it down in the comments if you recommend this lens as much lens as I do. I loved it, but do you? Write it down in the comments below.